This is our Chapter 9, Lecture 1. Our next chapter now begins our study of the region in Asia called South Asia. When we consider the next three chapters, we'll discuss of South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. We find that the vast majority of the world's population lives within these three regions. In South Asia, we have some of the most densely populated places on Earth. We have one of the fastest growing and developing places on Earth, included here with India and with Bangladesh being very densely populated. Let's begin by taking a look at our chapter learning outcomes for Chapter 9. We want to describe the climate characteristics that explain the influence of the wet and dry monsoons. Monsoon means season. It is not referring to a deluge of rain. It is referring to the seasonality of the climate called a monsoon climate, where it is wet during one season and dry during another. We want to identify the region's primary environmental and energy challenges. We shall explain how the historic movements of people and cultures resulted in South Asia's current cultural conflicts. We will link British colonial rule to the current economic contours of South Asia. We will identify social and economic forces that reinforce gender inequality in India. In most places in India, and of course that's not a rule completely, as there are a couple of places where actually women have a larger percentage of the population and larger influence. Describe how the process of globalization affects the lives of India's rural poor population. Compare India's urban industrial regimes and link their development to globalization and the government economic policies since 1990. And finally, contrast the political and economic constraints to greater levels of economic development in Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Let's begin taking a map look at our region. Here we have the geophysical map. We have Pakistan in the northwestern portion, much desert here. This is the location of the Indus River coming from the Himalaya Mountains, from the Karakoram range. This area borders on Afghanistan and has some heritage shared with parts of Afghanistan, and some ethnic groups shared as well. We have a desert region, rather arid region in Pakistan. In spite of the wet, dry monsoons, there actually are the western region of Pakistan in particular receives very little rainfall throughout the year. We have the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which includes the Indus River and the Ganges River. The Ganges River eventually drains through the Sundarban Delta region into the Bay of Bengal. Bangladesh is located on a large portion of this delta. India actually extends all the way to the east to the border with Myanmar and has a narrow passage that separates Nepal from Bangladesh, that is Indian territory. These areas are some of the highest populated regions in our study area for Chapter 9. We have the Deccan Plateau, about a 2,000 to 3,000 foot elevated plateau on the southern part of the peninsula of India. And we have the Eastern Ghats and the Western Ghats. Ghats means stairs and is a rising or escarpment from the coast to the plateau reaches, the Ghats or the escarpment are like a series of stair steps, and so they have received this name as the Ghats because they look like a series of stairs as they ascend to the plateau itself. Some of the coastal regions here are well watered from rain and that drains off of the plateau. And so these coastal regions in the southern part of the peninsula have very dense populations. We have the island of Sri Lanka, a separate country, a divided country, and we'll spend some time talking about the divisions there. And we have Bhutan in the northeastern portion of our region. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about these smaller countries and their influence in the region. This map is on page 408 of your text. South Asia's physical and human contexts. Just as a general beginning of our chapter, let's first mention that this is a monsoon climate. We have a wet summer season when the intertropical convergence zone has moved to the north of the equator. You have a dry season for the most part when the intertropical convergence zone moves south of the equator. Generally speaking, the region is flat with elevated features on its edge, in particular the Himalaya Mountains. Creating a separation from the continent of India, or the subcontinent of India and China. The Indian continental plate is moving underneath the Asian plate and forcing up the Himalayas, one of the youngest mountains in the world and the tallest mountains in the world. Hinduism as a religion has the largest influence of the region, especially to the majority of India itself. But Islam has been introduced to the region through invasions of various types, and both Bangladesh and Pakistan are primarily Islamic religious regions. Much of the region transformed through periods of British imperialism. The British altered the direction of the economy many times for their own purposes, and India served as a colony, and the British were highly extractive of the wealth of this region during their imperialistic and colonial periods in India, Pakistan, and the other countries in this region. Most of the region achieved independence after World War II, very much like what happened in Africa, south of the Sahara. The European countries spent many of their resources fighting World War II and were no longer able to support the colonies. In addition to the direction of independence brought about by the United Nations, countries in our current region of Chapter 9 of South Asia also experienced independence after the end of World War II. Precipitation in general increases as you go from the west part of this region of South Asia to the east. East is where we see the most precipitation. And much of the Indus Plain is arid, but is farmed due to the irrigation using the waters of the Indus River. Humid Bangladesh is characterized by semi-deciduous forests and vegetation, as well as a tropical rainforest vegetation. And we'll see how this influences the crops that are grown as we discuss this portion of our region. Water supply is seasonal, obviously tied very directly to the monsoon climate. In particular, water supply is refilled during the wet summer monsoon season or monsoon, and is often used very thoroughly coming into the more dry winter monsoon. The summer or wet monsoon provides 85% of the annual rainfall totals. Population distribution of South Asia very closely resembles our geophysical map in terms of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. We see the Ganges River region has very dense population, with the densest population being almost the entire country of Bangladesh. The Deccan Plateau region has lower population levels, but still very dense population throughout the entire rural agricultural region, as well as the urban areas within the plateau. We see the desert regions on either side of the Indus River, where irrigation isn't really possible. In western Pakistan and also northwestern India, we see desert regions and much lower population density than we see throughout the rest of the region. You see Sri Lanka, let me go back here. We see Sri Lanka having regions of dense population, as well as some less populated rural regions as well. All right, I seem to have some problems with brightness on my computer. Hopefully the video is showing this well. Go back to full screen mode. All right, but overall, as we were talking about, much of the region has extremely dense populations. As we move into the higher elevations of the Himalaya regions and the mountains in northern India, we have lower population density, as the steepness of these terrains make it difficult for the larger scale populations and wider agricultural practices. Let's talk about the monsoons here a little bit now. As we look at the summer rainfall amount map from page 410 in your text, what we see are that as the intertropical convergence zone, represented as a line where it sits in July by this red dotted line, we see that much of the region receives wind from the Indian Ocean regions and wet regions throughout Asia in general, throughout South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And so these very moist air masses move from the oceans onto the coasts and create much higher amounts of rainfall. Cherrapunji here, for example, receives 341 inches of rain. It is one of the wettest places in this monsoon climate in the high mountains. Orographic rain also comes into play as these wet air masses hit the region. Orographic rain enhances the amount of rainfall that falls in the first place, creating high rainfall regions, especially up the Bay of Bengal, in the higher elevations on the southern edge of the Himalaya Mountains. But in general, we see higher rainfall amounts off the Indian Peninsula into Southeast Asia, as well as through the Pacific Basin, Philippine Sea, Sea of Japan, higher amounts of rainfall. The one exception to that is, although there is more rain in the desert region of western Pakistan, 5.1 inches is not very much rain for the entire year, creating a desert-like condition even during the period of the summer monsoon, which is the wet period. If we compare that to the winter monsoon, we see the January intertropical convergence zone has moved south. We see much of the region in the Indian subcontinent has airflow coming off of the continental air mass, and that, of course, is very dry. We see the western desert of Pakistan only receives an additional 1.5 inches of rain. We see the wet regions where orographic precipitation would be prevalent, still having high amounts of rainfall, but much less than what occurs during the summer monsoons or the wet monsoons. As we move into the coastal regions of East Asia, the wet monsoons and then transferring to the winter times, dry monsoon seasons really are not that much drier, as still some of the effects of the Pacific Ocean draw moisture onto regions such as Japan and the Philippines, as well as parts of Southeast Asia. If we go back, I did want to mention that the Bay of Bengal here is a site of many cyclones, destructive hurricane-like storms, often larger than the hurricanes that we see in the Western Hemisphere. We have a region of low elevation in the Bangladesh, country of Bangladesh. We have high population density, and we have these cyclonic storms that periodically run up the Bay of Bengal into the delta of the Ganges River and create human disasters as people really have no place to go, and the population is so incredibly dense. Creates a very dangerous environmental condition for the people who live in this location. All right, let's talk about the Asian religions. This map is on page 415 of your text. We see a very strong Islamic influence in Pakistan, of course, bordering Afghanistan and Iran. This area was invaded back and forth over many centuries. The Islamic invaders passed on their religion to the region of Pakistan. However, in India, we find that Hinduism is the strongest religion throughout the entire portion of the region. With a few exceptions, we have the transitional religion of Sikhism. That's kind of a transition between Islamic and Hindu religions, often a response to the caste system that we'll talk about later. We have Buddhism along the areas of influence of China, where Chinese heritage individuals, Sino ethnic groups tend to be more prevalent. And so in northern India, in regions of Nepal and Bhutan, we have Buddhism more prominent. We have tribal religions in some of the mountains of eastern India. We have Christianity along the border with Myanmar, as well as the border between Bangladesh and India, the northern part of Bangladesh. Christianity is also common in some of the old ports and colonial regions on the coast that were impacted by European settlement. And so British, French, Portuguese settlements have strong Christian influences. Jainism is prevalent in eastern part of India near the Pakistan border. And so we have a interesting distribution of religions, some being transitional between religious regions, others being transitional across political regions, such as Buddhism. Mountains and monsoons. The monsoon climate, where monsoon means season, there's a different climate in each of the three subregions of Asia. And as we go into the other regions, we'll talk about these. But in the case of the monsoon climate of the Indian subcontinent, mountain-induced orographic precipitation is greatest in the Cherrapunja region of East India on the edge of the Himalayan mountains. Late southwestern monsoon seasons sometimes include cyclones that can be deadly to some of the lower densely populated regions, especially in the Bay of Bengal. Landforms, important landforms of this region include the Indo-Gangetic Plain, a very densely populated agricultural region, and also we have the Deccan Plateau that makes up the majority of southern India. And we have the mountains to the north that create kind of the northern boundary of our region of South Asia. Environmental challenges of the region. Air pollution is one of the most serious atmospheric environmental problems here, especially across the northern part of the region. The use of biofuels, such as animal manure and wood, release large amounts of particulate matter. Often cooking is done indoors, especially during the wet season, and children and women who do not have proper equipment to ventilate burning biomass materials ingest or inhale much of the particulate matter that comes off of the smoke from burning biomasses for cooking, in particular, in the rural and poor reaches of the Indo-Gangetic Plain, and especially in places like Bangladesh and northeastern Ganges region of India. So indoor pollution, air pollution, is a real problem. China has taken on this in some of the poor rural locations in China by providing better ventilation in cooking systems available in that country. This has not been introduced on a large scale in India or Bangladesh. Air pollution is also common in the north due to the industrialized regions such as Calcutta, using a large amount of coal for energy. There also is an increasing number of automotive and other motorized vehicles in the region, many using using leaded gas, and adding to the particulate matter pollution across the region. So those three primary sources have a very serious effect on the air pollution, especially in the northern and northeastern portions of India. Sustainable water is the most serious challenge to economic and social development. Water is very available during the monsoon season, but is often used quickly for irrigation of agriculture, and during the dry season, it's much more difficult to obtain the needed water, especially in some of the higher elevations. And as the population grows, demand for water grows, and this again adds to the difficulty of providing adequate water to a rapidly growing population that's already very large and is already straining the available water supply during the dry seasons. India's thirst for power generation has initiated plans for a number of upstream dam projects to generate hydroelectric power. These can affect the water supply, however, timing, and can affect agriculture of the rural populations as well. The Indo-Gangetic Plain, annual precipitation levels increase as we go from the west to the east, with the east having the highest amounts of population. Much of the Indus Plain is arid, but is agriculturally strong and has denser population due to the use of irrigation in agriculture in the arid plains in the southern part of the Indus Plain. Humid Bangladesh is characterized by semi-deciduous and tropical rainforest vegetation. We'll spend some time talking about some of the climate and geophysical characteristics coming in combination, the Sundarban region, as we begin our discussion of Bangladesh in later lectures. Water supply is seasonal as with the monsoon seasons, with summer or wet monsoons providing 85% of the annual rainfall totals. That's it for Chapter 9, Lecture 1, and we'll talk to you again, too, as we move on into our next lecture. Thanks for participating. See you soon.